Hi everyone, welcome back to Radio Night Crime. Before you drift off, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. If you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now let's relax and jump into tonight's case. Story 1. Fear is a negative and unpleasant feeling. Would anyone want to experience it over and over again? Cassandra and her twin brother Rob were the exception. As young children, they couldn't go a day without the scary stories they liked to tell each other in a room with the lights off. Rob was a natural storyteller, or at least he thought he was. Cassandra would scream at every story he told, and he, playing the brave though small man, would sprawl on his bed mumbling, "You can't even scare the neighbor's little Joey with stories like that." No, scary stories are not your thing. They also watched the animated series Scooby-Doo together, and while watching it they argued over which of the characters in the story would turn out to be a ghost or a vampire in disguise. Cassandra's intuitive guesses were often ahead of her brother, and then he was nervous. Their mother, Mary Smith, although she did not share the passion of the twins, but to instill in her children a love of reading, bought them books by Robert Wall. Love for scary stories was not a childhood hobby, but a passion that brother and sister carried through life. They even collected figurines of villains, and as adults seriously considered opening a themed store associated with this culture of horror. An interest in horror movies brought Cassandra to the set in 2004. She got a cameo in a scary movie that, although it didn't become popular, still caused a storm of envy in Rob, and he started asking his sister to make a deal for him. "You must have made some acquaintances there, right? I'm ready to play anyone. Well, talk, CAS, please. I'm pretty close with the head of the cast. Maybe something will come out of it, but no promises. I got the part by accident myself, after all," Cassandra replied. Roby was very happy, but to play, albeit in an episodic role, he was not able to. The head of the cast in that movie was Colin Dudley, and on the set between him and debuting actress flashed a spark. To make the first step, each of them did not dare. That all changed during a corporate Halloween party. Cassandra dressed up as Velma from Scooby-Doo, and Colin dressed up as Alex from A Clockwork Orange. And if for Cassandra the image of the cartoon character was just an image, then for Colin Dudley it seemed he was something more. He was walking with a glass of milk all evening, looking at everyone with a glare, just as his character did in the movie, and also he talked a lot of quotes from the book. For example, looking at Cassandra with delight, he said, "Beauty invariably caused my only desire to destroy it, for it did not fit at all into our ugly world." Cassandra thought it was a compliment, and they soon began dating, but their relationship didn't last long, only a couple months. Colin found another actress, Rebecca, and started dating her, and later on the couple started living together. August 25, 2020, Cassandra Cantrell disappeared. She, without warning anyone, drove her car away from home, in an unknown direction, and did not answer phone calls. The police officers were very reluctant to take a report from her mother for a very long time, trying to calm the poor woman down, and saying that sometimes children grow up and don't always warn their parents when they go out with friends. But Mary Smith was sure that something terrible had happened, and maybe if the lazy cops would finally start working, she would still have a chance to see her daughter alive. The search for Cassandra did not begin until 2 days later, and on the third day, the police found her car under a bridge, not in the most favorable area. Also, to add to the bad news, the car was unlocked, and the keys were inside. It was impossible to understand what Cassandra was doing here. This place was considered a neighborhood of homeless people, where with frequent frequency the police found their bodies, killed in a domestic fight, or died of an overdose of illegal drugs. The officers had to go around the neighborhood, questioning a lot of homeless people who, at the sight of the police, tried to get away for a while, but it was all to no avail. None of them had seen Cassandra, and none of them knew when the car showed up here. It was hard to expect anything else from the residents who lived under the bridge and drank alcohol all day long. The detective involved in the search for Cassandra had requested her cell phone billing, as he was instructed to do, but from experience he was sure it would get him nowhere. So it did. The signal showed that the phone was in the nearest body of water to the bridge, which meant that the detectives would not be able to recover it and get the information they needed. Nevertheless, A team of divers began searching the coastal area, and before they did so, standing on the shore, they picked up rocks from the ground and threw them into the water, testing how far they could throw the phone. Cassandra's mother said that her missing daughter's phone case was decorated with rhinestones, which meant it would not be difficult to find. Indeed, the phone was soon found, but Cassandra's body was not in the water. This was presented to her mother as good news, but the poor woman did not feel any better. She seemed to have gotten used to the idea that her daughter was dead, and the only thing she wanted was for her body to be found, and for this nightmare of uncertainty to end. I was looking forward to my granddaughter. I wanted to be a grandmother sooner, and I didn't even have time to give her a crib. It's just sitting in the garage in a box. What should I do with it now? Saddened the mother and did not realize that this became important information for the investigation. According to statistics, a high percentage of crimes against pregnant women are committed by their partners, the fathers-to-be. But Mary Smith did not know who the father of her future granddaughter was. Cassandra, as it seemed to her, despite her already realized age, was not married and did not even meet anyone. It was understandable that she had gotten pregnant by a man, but Mary had no information about the potential father of the child. Although, again from the words of her mother, her daughter very often corresponded with someone and called, but the phone number of her interlocutor for some reason was not recorded in the daughter's book, and the mother of course did not remember the numbers. She just noticed that it is quite strange to communicate so often with a person and not write down his number. Girls, as it was known, could not keep their relationships in absolute secrecy, and there should be at least one friend with whom Cassandra shared her secrets, and especially if those secrets were related to pregnancy. And such a friend was found. In a conversation with police officers, she revealed that Cassandra had rekindled her relationship with her former boyfriend, Colin Dudley. Yes, their past relationship in 2004 was short-lived, and besides, it's been 15 years since their breakup. It is strange in general that after so much time they remembered each other. As it turned out, Colin himself came out to Cassandra, with whom he once worked on a movie set. In 2014, he found Cassandra on Facebook, wrote some warm words and confessed that just recently his father died, with whom his wife, Rebecca, had a difficult relationship, and so he had no one to share his grief with. Cassandra, purely because of friendly motives, decided to meet and talk to the ex-boyfriend to calm him down. But the friendly meeting turned into something more. Since 2014, Colin began to live literally on two families, where Cassandra was in the status of mistress. When the young woman found out that she was pregnant, she did not want to inform Colin Dudley because every time she wanted to admit it to him, she recalled their conversation where Colin said that he absolutely did not want children and that he was very happy about Rebecca being infertile. The news that he might have a daughter or son could destroy a real family, and Cassandra didn't want to hurt her lover, so she kept the news a secret. Meanwhile, her belly was growing, and it was impossible to hide it under the oversized sweaters. And in order to Colin did not guess anything, Cassandra stopped seeing him, but how to move on. She couldn't hide it for long, and if she lied about having another boyfriend, it would hurt Colin and cause them to break up. Cassandra decided that the bitter truth was better than a sweet lie, so she told Colin over the phone that she was expecting a child with him. Colin was silent for a while, and then he finally said that he was delighted to hear the news. It sounded very strange, but Cassandra concluded that Colin was genuinely pleased. The detective arrived at Colin's house, knocked on the door, and his wife opened it. Deciding that it wasn't quite ethical to talk about a missing mistress in the presence of Colin's legal wife, the detective introduced himself as an old friend of Dudley's. Colin came out, immediately shut the door behind him, and walked away from the house with the detective, though the latter hadn't even introduced himself yet. It was as if he had been waiting for this meeting. "Thank you for not making your credentials public in front of Rebecca. You're a man of honor, a true officer. My compliments to you." Colin spoke in short sentences. "I heard Cassandra is missing. It's weird, bloody weird. I can't even guess where she might have gone. She told me she'd had a big fight with her brother and was really worried about it. I advised her to stop by and make up with him. I don't know if she listened to me or not. That Cassandra and Rob had been in a fight, the detective knew. Rob had told him about it himself. It was nothing serious, just a family misunderstanding, but nevertheless, Cassandra's twin brother had been very upset about it, because the day she disappeared, Cassandra had called him and wanted to come and talk to him, but his proud brother had refused, and now he blamed himself for it. If his sister had come to see him that day, she wouldn't have disappeared. You know, officer, I'm not the nicest person. I think you realize that dating my ex-girlfriend in secret from my wife, and for such a long period of time, I'm sure I'll be punished for it in the next world. But the human heart doesn't decide who you fall in love with. In 2014, my father died. He literally hated Rebecca with all his soul, and the feeling was mutual. But he really liked Cassandra. He often remembered her, reproached me for the fact that we broke up with her almost immediately after Christmas. We often fight with our parents, accusing them of not understanding, and then it turns out that it's us, their children, who don't understand, and it hurts. My father was right, of course, and after he died, I just wanted to fulfill one of his wishes, and so I resumed my relationship with Cassandra. Rebecca needed to be broken up with. It was a conversation I kept putting off. You know, this family stuff sucks you dry, so I kept stalling. I've been living a double life for 5 years. It was hell. I had to make excuses for coming home late all the time. To hide it, I'd tell her about some fictitious business trips and even bought a fishing rod. Even though I hated fishing, a stupid pastime, and I'd tell Rebecca I was going to the lake while I went to Cassandra's. Before coming home, I'd buy fish at the supermarket for extra convincing, and Rebecca would bake it in the oven and I'd eat it, even though the smell of fish makes me sick. Did you know Cassandra was pregnant? What? Pregnant? By whom? I don't have that information, but she told a close friend of hers that it was from you. That can't be true. She's been adamantly refusing to see me lately, and I guess I understand her and can't blame her for that. Naturally, she was tired of being in the background and wanted a family, which unfortunately I couldn't give her. I guess that the reason she refused to see me was because she had found someone else. When was the last time you saw her? Asked Detective Colin. Honestly, I can't even remember. I think it was about 3 months ago, maybe 4 if you don't count the time we literally ran into her at the mall by chance. But that was fleeting because my wife was in the fitting room and I just got tired of waiting for her and decided to take a walk to the coffee shop. Tell me, officer, is there any chance you'll find her alive? Dudley asked one last time. We're doing everything we can. Believe me. This was not Colin's last encounter with the detective, even though Cassandra's phone, which was lifted from the bottom of the pond and could not be recovered. But the police requested the details of the calls of the missing person, and it turned out that most likely, the unsigned number about which her mother told her, belongs to Colin Dudley. Most often Cassandra called him, and even on the day of her disappearance, they called each other. In addition, on that day, the police received CCTV footage from the train station near the bridge, where Cassandra's abandoned car had been found, and on it they saw a strange man who stood out in the crowd of passengers on the platform. He wore a long cloak, gloves, his face was swathed in a scarf, and a hat was placed on his head, the sides of which covered his eyes. It was impossible to make out the face, but the detective said that the man's gait reminded him very much of Colin Dudley. As for the hat, it was almost identical to the one worn by Alex from A Clockwork Orange. After continuing to follow the strange man through the CCTV cameras, the detectives noticed that he literally went into the cafe for a few minutes, then came out of there and went towards the parking lot, where he got into his car and drove away. During all this time, the stranger never showed his face, but they could see the license plate number of the car in which the stranger got into, and the car belonged to Colin Dudley. A unit was sent to his house with a search warrant. The detectives had hoped that Cassandra was alive and in the basement at Dudley's house. At first, there was no evidence of a murder at Colin's house. But in the closet, they found the very hat Colin was trying to cover himself with. They then went down to the basement, but Cassandra was not there, nor was there any evidence of the crime. However, the service dog, which was trained to search by the scent of blood, barked as it sniffed the couch, and that was already a very alarming bell. Colin assured that he had done nothing illegal, that the police simply had no evidence and no other suspects, so they were trying to pin the crime on him, an innocent man. The detective interviewed his wife, who of course was shocked at what was going on in their home, at the accusations against her husband, and at the fact that she had been deceived for years. Yes, she could say a lot of things about her husband and her emotions, But when the detective asked her if her husband was capable of murder, she, after thinking about it for a long time, answered in the negative. All the evidence that had been found against Colin wasn't enough to put him in jail, which made Rob and Mary Smith very angry, and the detective was just throwing up his hands. Colin was called in for questioning again. He thought carefully about the crime as he had an alibi for all the allegations. On the morning of August 25th at 6:30 a.m., Colin visited a hardware store where he purchased household cleaning chemicals as well as trash bags, and indeed, the store's cameras confirmed it, but the large trash bags overshadowed this situation. Colin then received a text message from Cassandra that she was almost at his house, but he immediately deleted the message, but it remained in the cell phone carrier's memory, and the police got it from the call and message dump. Also, according to their cell phone billing, the couple did not leave the house that morning for several hours. Colin then turned off his phone, but left his mistress's phone on, most likely by accident, and police saw the entire path of his movements, including where he was seen on the station's cameras. As the police already knew, after the cafe, where he was probably recovering from the murder by washing up in the toilet, Colin got into his car and drove to the pond where he had dumped Cassandra's phone, where the last signal from the cell phone had been received. It was now necessary to search for Cassandra's body. The police, in order to accurately track the route, seized a GPS tracker from Colin's car. The device completely replicated the movement of Cassandra's cell phone signal, but there was new evidence in the case based on his movements the next day. The cops retraced his path that went through the woods, and there, in a ravine, they spotted a huge trash can tied with ropes. All the ground around it was covered in blood, and it became clear what was in the container. Yeah, they were right. By then, it had been a month since the murder, and identifying the body was difficult. The police were helped by Cassandra's tattoo, which was described in the search notes. Colin was apprehended the same day and charged with murder. Forensics conducted a forensic examination and indicated that death was caused by a fractured skull due to blunt force trauma. During the examination of the basement of the Dudley house, the police found traces of blood which could not be completely cleaned. Rebecca knew nothing about the murder. All day, she spent in another part of the house, from which no noise in the basement cannot be heard, and she also confirmed that Colin never wanted children, and his story about her infertility, just a fiction. The police took this as a motive for the crime. During the trial, due to the lack of witnesses, physical evidence, such as the murder weapon, it was impossible to convince the jury that the murder was committed by Colin Dudley. Then, the court made a deal with the killer that if he pleaded guilty, he would get a lesser sentence. Colin was sentenced to 26 years in prison. Cassandra's mother and her brother, who still felt guilty that he had not agreed to meet with his sister before her death, were very upset, because the killer would most likely live to see the moment when he could go free. Story 2. The Rachel O'Reilly case, one of Ireland's most violent crimes. When a person disappears without a trace or dies in mysterious circumstances, usually the other half is among the main suspects. Unfortunately, in about 80% of cases, suspicions are justified. In such crimes, there is usually not even a clear motive, and the crime itself has been defined as domestic, as if it were something ordinary. In the early 2000s, the high-profile case of Rachel O'Reilly literally shocked the whole of Ireland with its unprecedented cruelty and cold-bloodedness. A young woman and mother of 2 young children was brutally murdered in her own home, and police officers who arrived on the scene admitted that they had never in their practice encountered such a horrific crime scene. To solve this mystery and put all the pieces of the puzzle together, it took investigators several years of painstaking work. All this time, the criminal remained at large and was sure that his guilt no one and never prove. Perhaps it would have happened, but the killer was let down by his own vanity. Well, let's take the whole story from the beginning. Who was Rachel O'Reilly? Rachel O'Reilly, maiden name Callaly, was born in 1974 on the northern outskirts of County Dublin, Ireland. His biological parents' girl did not know. At an early age, she was adopted by spouses Rose and Jim Callaly, and she was brought up with 4 other adopted children of the couple. Their own heirs, Rose and Jim, could not have, so all their parental love without a trace gave foster children. From a small age, Rachel was an active and purposeful child. She studied well in school, played sports, helped her parents in the household, and never caused any problems. The girl grew up sociable, open, and incredibly kind. She easily got along with everyone and avoided any conflicts. As a teenager, Rachel was seriously engaged in softball, constantly took part in various competitions, and even set several local records. She also had a very strong bond with her foster mother, to whom she confided all her secrets and with whom she communicated constantly, even after she married and had children of her own. After graduating from high school, the girl enrolled in one of the local universities, deciding to get a degree in marketing. At the same time, she got a job as a salesperson in a city department store, and in her spare time she continued to play sports, playing for the local team. Who is Joe O'Reilly? In fact, there is not much information about Joe O'Reilly's early life in public sources. He was famous for his inhumanity and extreme cruelty to his own spouse and the mother of his 2 children. But what kind of person he was as a young man is hardly ever talked about or remembered. It is known that Joe is also a native of County Dublin, where he was born in 1972 in a simple family. He was the second common child of his parents and was raised with his older sister. The children of the O'Reilly couple were not spoiled, and parents taught them that in life everything should be achieved independently by their own efforts and hard work. The boy was quite tall, athletic, and was also fond of softball. After graduating from high school, he decided to study advertising by correspondence, and to earn a living, he got a job as a manager in a department store, the same department store where Rachel came a few months later. At the time of their first meeting, Joe was 19 years old and Rachel was barely 17. The young man immediately noticed the new employee and took the initiative to be the first to meet her. Miniature smiling blonde literally dizzy the guy's head, but only to go on a date with him. She, for some reason, categorically refused. Joe began to woo Rachel, said compliments, made little surprises in the form of flowers or chocolates at her workplace at the beginning of the day, but Rachel still remained cold to him. Desperate attempts to get the attention of the young saleswoman, with interest, watched almost the entire staff of the department store, and it even became a reason for jokes. However, Joe did not give up. He read Rachel's favorite book so that they have a common topic for conversation. But it was only when Joe found out that Rachel was a serious softball player that things got off the ground. That's when he joined her at the stadium and walked onto the field during practice and joined the game. Since O'Reilly was long and familiar with softball, he showed all his skills and led the team to victory. This time the young man managed to impress Rachel, and she finally agreed to go on a date with him. Their relationship developed rapidly, and Joe by all means and available ways to show that he is ready for the beloved to literally roll mountains. He unexpectedly organized for his beloved a trip to the most romantic city in the world, Paris, and there on top of the Eiffel Tower he asked for her hand in marriage. Of course Rachel could not resist, and answered him in agreement. Then the naive girl thought that she met a real prince from a magical fairy tale, with whom she will live a long and happy life. A few years later, the couple married, and then, one after the other, they had 2 sons in common. The couple moved to the quiet and picturesque Scottish province of Null, where they purchased their own spacious, cozy home. It was the perfect place to raise their children. After the birth of their eldest son, Rachel left her job and became a housewife, devoting herself to the care of her husband and child. And 2 years later, the couple had a second son. So the young mother was completely absorbed by the heirs, and the main gainer in the family was Joe, who got a job in an advertising agency as a specialist in outdoor advertising. Those who were personally acquainted with the head of the family described him as a confident, purposeful, and not devoid of charming man. At work, he proved himself as a responsible, qualified specialist, punctual and attentive. He was the first to arrive at the office and always stayed late, if the situation required it. Joe also continued to be active in sports, often stopping by the gym before the workday began, and in his and his wife's house, there were several exercise machines and a set of dumbbells. Over time, when the boys grew up a little and began to attend kindergarten, Rachel, in order to have their own additional income, became a distributor for one of the popular cosmetics companies and also sold household goods. Such work allowed her to communicate more with neighbors, who spoke of her as a wonderful mother, a kind and open person. As time went on, Joe became less and less likely to come home. In fact, he came only to sleep, shower, and change his clothes. This behavior he wrote off the total employment at work and the upcoming promotion, which he was so looking forward to. His wife supported him as best she could, but gradually they began to drift apart, and family relations deteriorated markedly. In the summer of 2004, there was one extremely unpleasant event. An anonymous person sent a letter to Child Protective Services, which stated that Rachel is a bad mother and mistreats her sons, who at that time were 4 and 2 years old. In this regard, a special commission visited the couple's home and responded to the disturbing report. Although nothing suspicious was found, and all relatives and neighbors described Mrs. O'Reilly as a loving and caring mother, the letter cast a shadow on her reputation. What happened to Rachel O'Reilly? The morning of Monday, October 4th, 2004, began as usual. The head of the family left the house at dawn, while his wife and sons were still asleep, and went to work. Throughout the day, he texted and called his wife several times, but there was no answer. Then he called his home phone, but the answering machine went off, and Joe said in a shaky voice that he was very worried, and asked his wife to call him back as soon as possible. In the afternoon, Joe received a call from the kindergarten teacher saying that Rachel had not come to pick up the boys, which had never happened before. Then Joe called his mother-in-law and asked if she knew where Rachel was, and when she said no, he asked Rose to go to their house and see if everything was all right. In the meantime, he went to the kindergarten to pick up the children. When Rose arrived at her daughter's home, she saw her car in the yard and realized that Rachel was home. However, the room itself was dark and quiet, and no one answered her call. The first thing that caught Rose's eye was the clutter, as if the house had been searched for something. Cabinets and drawers were open, their contents strewn on the floor. The whole thing looked like a robbery. The landlady was nowhere to be found, but when her mother entered the bedroom, a horrifying picture appeared before her eyes. Rachel was lying on the floor in a huge pool of her own blood. There was blood everywhere, on the walls, furniture, and even the ceiling, and through Rachel's bloody, tangled hair. In some places, the bare bones of her skull could be seen. Rose rushed to her daughter, hoping she was still alive and could be helped, but when she touched her arm, she felt the limb was cold and stiff. Rachel had been dead for hours, and there was no way to help her. Unable to remember herself, Rose started screaming and calling for help, and then rushed to the phone to call the police. At her screams, the neighbors, among whom was a doctor, came running. He was the first to examine the body and confirmed that Rachel could not be helped. When Joe arrived at the house, there was already a crowd of people there. When he learned that his spouse was dead, he screamed and ran inside, saying he didn't believe it. In the bedroom, by his wife's body, he became hysterical. O'Reilly cried, screamed, and promised to kill whoever had done this to his beloved wife. According to police officers who arrived on the scene, they have never seen a more brutal picture of the massacre of a defenseless woman in their practice. Obviously, the weapon of the crime was some heavy, blunt object, which Rachel was beaten with incredible ferocity. There's literally nothing left on her body. Apparently, the owner of the house was attacked from behind because she did not even try to resist or fight back. The overall picture really resembled a robbery, but professional instinct told the investigators that such a beating only with personal motives or acute dislike. But who would have a hand on a petite young woman and mother of 2 children? The first thing detectives did was to interview family members and neighbors of the deceased. All of them confidently stated that Rachel had no enemies or ill-wishers, and that she was on friendly terms with everyone. Neighbors on that day did not notice anything suspicious. No strange cars or any strangers near the victim's house. Joe stated that he had been at the bus depot on the other side of town most of the day, where he had gone for work, and his alibi could be confirmed by a coworker. The coworker did confirm Joe's words, but the police were still haunted by vague doubts. Something was definitely wrong here. The situation looked like a robbery, but nothing of value had been taken, only scattered items. In the bedside table of the bedroom, almost in plain sight, lay €1,000, which remained untouched. Another stash was in a kitchen cupboard, but this too was untouched. There was also a jewelry box on the dressing table, but only a pair of chains and earrings were missing, lying separately in a drawer. In addition, according to the homeowner, a digital camera, silverware, and one of his dumbbells, which was probably the weapon of crime, were missing. It all seemed too strange. The house was turned upside down, the landlady brutally murdered, and all this over some little thing. Joe, answering police questions, was crying, shaking, and feverish, but as one of the investigators later admitted, it seemed to him that such a state of the guy was not grief or shock at all, but rather like nervous excitement. O'Reilly behaved even more strangely when asked if his wife might have had an affair on the side. Joe changed his face and confidently stated that there was no such thing, and then added that he had not cheated on his wife, but this phrase sounded very unconvincing. 2 miles from the scene of the crime, in the bushes, was found a bag with things missing from the house. Inside was a camera, silverware, and a couple of pieces of jewelry. All items were from the list of stolen items that Joe had compiled. Now the robbery theory could be dismissed completely, and the case could be reclassified as premeditated murder. Suspicious widower. In spite of all the widowed fellow's attempts to portray grief and pain, it looked fake, and he immediately became the main suspect. Joe had nothing to present yet, but the detectives had to check his alibi in detail to study the scene of the crime and learn about their relationship with his wife. Joe said that in the morning before work he decided to stop by the gym, which he did regularly, and the surveillance cameras in the parking lot, as well as in the gym itself, confirmed it. He then drove to the office, and from there he went to a bus station in a remote part of the city in order to monitor the placement of advertisements on vehicles. His words were confirmed by a colleague with whom he allegedly called at the time. The investigators then went to Joe's workplace, where they seized his computer for inspection. This is where the most interesting part began, because the email contained strange correspondence, which Joe had partially deleted. Specialists were able to recover the deleted messages, and the police were finally convinced that they were going in the right direction. Most often Joe corresponded with his friend and his own sister, and to both of them he constantly complained about his wife. He wrote about Rachel using insults and profanity. He wrote that his wife had not attracted him as a woman for a long time, and in general causes him outright disgust. Moreover, the computer found another curious correspondence between Joe and one of his colleagues, a woman named Nikki Pelly. From their communication it was clear that these two were much closer than just friends, and they should both be questioned. Who's Nikki Pelly? Nikki also worked for an advertising company, and she and Joe had a lot of work-related interactions. The woman was 10 years older than Joe, but that didn't stop them from having an affair. When exactly began their workplace romance, it was not possible to establish, but it was at her Joe spent evenings and even nights, and his wife lied about the fact that too busy with work. But this was not the strangest thing in the discovered correspondence. It turned out that Joe had promised Nikki in his messages that they would soon be together, he, she, and their sons, referring to his children with Rachel. Such messages were more than suspicious because in the event of a divorce, the boys would be left to live with their mother. Joe, who initially claimed that he had no affairs on the side, realized that it was pointless to deny it because irrefutable evidence of his infidelity was found. Then he admitted that he had indeed been secretly dating Nikki for a while, but then they allegedly broke up. For more than a week, the O'Reilly house was cordoned off as a crime scene, and no one was allowed in because the police needed to scrutinize and document everything. During this time, Joe was staying with his sister and the boys were staying with their grandparents. At the funeral, Joe didn't look like a grieving widower. He acted remarkably calm, and most importantly, as if he was shunning the coffin with his late wife. When it was his turn to say goodbye, he did so quickly, coldly, and as he left, he indifferently said that the coffin could be closed and buried. When the family was allowed to return home, everything there looked as it had on the day of the crime, except for the body on the floor. Joe asked his father-in-law and mother-in-law to go with him, and they agreed, figuring he needed the support. On the spot, however, the son-in-law suddenly began to speculate about how the killer might have dealt with Rachel. He walked around the room in which his wife had been murdered, and described how she had the force with which she had been struck, pointing each time to dried blood spatters. Joe then suggested that the perpetrator might have gone to the bathroom to wash the blood off his hands and the crime weapon, which he then took with him. His account was horrifyingly detailed and full of detail, with Joe also waving his arms around to mimic the blows. However, his grief-stricken parents wrote off his behavior as an attempt to relieve stress and talk it out. Although Rose later admitted that all this time, she did not let go of the idea that the son-in-law repeats the actions committed by him earlier, and it was he who massacred their daughter. Thirst for fame. Almost immediately after the funeral, O'Reilly began to actively communicate with the press, giving interviews left and right. He willingly invited reporters to his home, literally arranging them tours of the scene of the crime, and described how everything happened. At the same time, Joe every time on camera addressed the criminal, offering him to voluntarily surrender to the police. 3 weeks after the tragedy, the loved ones of the deceased agreed to participate in the shooting of a TV program devoted to this crime. But if Rachel's parents were depressed and literally killed by grief, then Joe on the set behaved as if he was a star. He vividly communicated with the makeup artists, interested in how he will look like in the frame, and in the breaks eagerly nibbled on the proposed treats, drinking their coffee. The police, who were still looking at Joe, decided to follow him, and found that from the set he went straight to his mistress, Nikki, who spent the night. By that time, the last doubts that he was the killer had already been dispelled, and it remained only to collect irrefutable evidence for the court. Gathering evidence was a very long, complicated, and painstaking process, because the most important thing, the instrument of the crime, was not found. Nevertheless, there was enough other evidence. The first to speak were Nikki and the colleague who had confirmed Joe's alibi. They were both facing jail time for perjury, so they decided not to risk their freedom. Nikki admitted that she and Joe had not broken up at all, as they claimed earlier, but continued their relationship. Moreover, about their connection found out Rachel, because of which the spouses had a big scandal on the eve of the tragedy. The colleague, however, said that he was not sure whether Joe was at the time of his wife's murder at the bus station on the other side of the city. The guy simply confirmed his friend's words at his request, not knowing at the time that O'Reilly was a suspect in the crime. Recovered correspondence from Joe's computer, in which he insulted his wife and planned his future with his mistress and children, was also attached to the case. The police also examined numerous interviews with Joe and footage from the TV program, and concluded that he described the crime in the kind of detail that only a criminal could know. In part, it was the widower's careless remarks that made it possible to reconstruct the full picture of the crime. In the morning, he really went to the gym, deliberately getting into the lenses of all the cameras there. Then he also warned his colleagues that he would be absent from the office, because he would leave for work in another part of the city and his phone may not be available. Then he went not to the bus station, as he said, but to his home, where he armed himself with a dumbbell and hid in the marital bedroom, waiting for his wife, who had left to take the children to kindergarten. He attacked her suddenly, from behind, leaving no chance of escape. After the massacre, Joe, as he himself admitted, washed off the blood from himself and the murder weapon in the bathroom adjacent to the bedroom. The perpetrator then changed his clothes, scattered his belongings around the house to simulate a robbery, and went to work. On the way, he threw the items away and disposed of the soiled clothes and dumbbells so that they would not be found. He also thoughtfully called his already murdered wife's cell phone several times, sent her a couple of messages and recorded voicemails on the answering machine, asking her to call him back. In the office, he was acting strangely and looked overexcited, and his hands were shaking slightly. Some of his colleagues noticed this and asked if he was all right, but Joe was confused and instead of answering, he hurried to his office, where he soon received a call from the daycare center, informing him that the boys had not been picked up. He did not hurry to go home, but instead sent his mother-in-law to be the first to find his daughter's disfigured body. He thought he had thought of everything and that his guilt would be impossible to prove, but his thirst for fame and public attention played against him. Joe was not taken into custody until 2 years after his crime. Despite the fact that most of the evidence was circumstantial, Joe's guilt was proved by reconstructing the entire route of his movements that day on the signal of a cell phone, with which he did not part. It is noteworthy that at the time of Rachel's murder, Joe's cell phone signal came from the family home. It was verified later with the help of billing. In addition, it was revealed at trial that the anonymous letter to Child Protective Services was written by Joe's mother at the request of her son. Joe knew that he would not have sole custody of the boys in the event of a divorce, so he tried to smear his wife by making her look like a bad and abusive mother. But social services officials found no corroboration for what the anonymous message said, so O'Reilly decided to act. For sure, he felt no remorse. He smiled in the courtroom, talked animatedly with his defense attorneys, and even tried to joke, believing that he would be released anyway. But in the summer of 2007, the court found Joe guilty and sentenced him to life imprisonment. The lawyers tried to challenge this decision, but all their complaints and appeals were rejected. It is noteworthy that the relationship between Joe and Nikki continued even after the guy went to prison. His mistress visited him regularly for many years, but in 2022, for unknown reasons, they stopped communicating. Joe O'Reilly never pleaded guilty. In prison, he has become a model inmate who never causes any trouble, hoping to achieve parole eligibility one day. Story 3. According to official figures, more than tens of millions of people go missing every year around the world. About a third of them are found alive and unharmed. Almost half of them are found after a while dead as a result of accidents or murdered, and about 2 million people disappear without a trace every year. The latter are usually found neither alive nor dead, even after many years. The story of Agnes Klavina made a lot of noise in the fall of 2014, when a young and very attractive woman who was having fun in a club with friends as if vanished into thin air. Everyone who might have been involved seemed to escape any responsibility. However, in 2023, 9 years after the tragedy, the case took a completely unexpected turn. But let's get to the bottom of it. Who is Agnes Klavina? Our today's heroine was born in 1984, July 8th, in the capital of Latvia, the city of Riga. She grew up in an ordinary family and became the youngest of 2 daughters of her parents. Agnes' own sister Greta was only a couple of years older than her, so the girls were always very friendly and almost inseparable. The parents did their best to give their daughters a good education and let them realize their dreams. Agnes grew up a sociable, cheerful, and very active girl. She did well at school, played sports, and had a lot of friends. In the future, she dreamed to connect her profession with tourism or entertainment, because she loved to travel and knew how to organize perfect leisure time. In addition, Agnes also had a bright appearance and a spectacular figure, so men always gave her their attention and compliments. The girl from a young age has always had a lot of admirers who in every way to get her attention. After graduating from school, Agnes worked for some time in the service industry while attending language courses and studying to be a tourism manager. At the age of 20, she decided to move from her native Latvia to the foggy Albion and settled in London. She believed that here she would have more prospects and opportunities to unlock all her potential and talents. Parents and older sister did not oppose her decision and sincerely supported. Soon after the move, the beautiful blonde met a young man whose name was Michael Mills. He was older than Agnes by 8 years, had a good education, owned his own thriving business, opened a small movie theater and entertainment complex, and was considered a very successful man. He and Agnes quickly found a common language and soon began dating. Michael wooed Agnes beautifully, gave expensive gifts. Together they traveled and made far-reaching plans for their future together. The couple was truly in love and happy. It seemed that a long and prosperous life awaited them. According to the memories of those close to Agnes, this was her first true love. She seemed to glow at the sight of her chosen one and dreamed of becoming his lawful wife soon. In 2014, Klavina was offered a 3-month labor contract as an administrator in one of the largest and most popular nightclubs in the Spanish resort town of Marbella. Naturally, this job implied a temporary move to another country, but the ambitious and purposeful young woman did not want to miss this opportunity at all. Michael could not give up everything and go to Spain with his beloved because of his job, but he was not against her signing the contract. For Agnes, it was a great opportunity to try herself in a new field of activity, to gain invaluable experience, and perhaps further move and develop in this direction. It should be noted that Marbella is one of the most famous and attractive resorts on the Mediterranean coast. Here come vacationers from different parts of the world, mostly wealthy people who go to have fun and spend money. Here you can often meet show business stars, as well as famous athletes and businessmen. Klavina, who has always been very sociable, liked working in such a place. Before moving, she visited her family in Latvia and told them that she had signed a favorable employment contract for 3 months. She also shared another piece of good news. After returning to England, she and Michael were planning to get married. Dad, Mom and sister were genuinely happy for Agnes and wished her luck. At the end of May 2014, Agnes, having packed only the most necessary things for one season, went to work in sunny Spain. Her lover stayed in London, but they called each other daily and communicated via video link, telling each other about everything that was happening to them. Klavina actively maintained her pages in various popular social networks, where she posted daily photos, small videos, and stories. She got a lot of followers who closely followed her activities and work. It was obvious that Agnes lived an interesting, busy life and enjoyed every day. After the end of her employment contract, Agnes decided to stay in Spain for a couple more months. It was the beginning of the velvet season in the resort, and during this period it was possible to earn good money. She consulted her boyfriend, and he supported her and promised to visit her for a few days, because they had not seen each other for a long time and missed each other very much. Agnes almost immediately got a job as a hostess in a high-end restaurant and renewed her lease. In September, as expected, Michael visited her. They were having fun, planning the upcoming wedding and choosing a place to go on honeymoon. Less than a week later, the young man returned back to London and Agnes had to work in Spain for another month, after which she was going to visit her relatives in Latvia and then fly to England to her lover. But these plans, alas, were not destined to come true. On September 6th, Agnes, in the company of her friends, went to one of the popular nightclubs in the region, the Costa del Sol. A few hours before, she had called her fiancé, who was aware of her plans and did not object to Agnes having fun with her friends. The young people enjoyed themselves and took pictures together, and Agnes posted several of them on her online profile that night. According to the memories of those who saw her that fatal night, the bright blonde was wearing a spectacular short dress and carrying a tiny white clutch handbag. Toward morning, when the friends were about to go home, Agnes said she planned to stay a little longer and then take a cab. She was always quite serious and responsible, and Agnes had not had much to drink, so her companions saw no reason to worry. At that moment, when the friends said goodbye and headed for the exit, Klavina was talking to a man who had bought her a cocktail and was clearly trying to win Agnes' favor. After that night, Klavina was never seen again, alive or dead. It seemed as if she had simply vanished into the crowded nightclub. No one could remember what time and with whom the blonde left the establishment or where she had gone afterwards. The next day, Agnes did not show up at work, and when trying to contact her, it turned out that her phone was switched off. Colleagues and friends were the first to raise the alarm, but the police were slow to respond to their missing persons report. Toward evening, a worried Michael called Agnes' mother and said that he had been unable to contact his fiancée all day, which had never happened before. The next day, Agnes' parents and fiancé jointly tried to contact the Spanish police to report the disappearance. However, they were told that the relatives had to file such a report in person, otherwise it would not be considered. After these words, Michael and Klavin's family took the next flight to Marbella. In the end, the missing persons report was filed by the family only 5 days after Agnes had disappeared without a trace. The first thing that was checked was the apartment Agnes had rented, but it looked as if the owner had gone out for a while and would be back soon. Documents, money, and a few expensive pieces of jewelry were in their places. The refrigerator was stocked with prepared food, and on the bed were several outfits from which Agnes had chosen what to wear to the club on her last night. It was obvious that Klavina had not been in her apartment since the day she had gone out with her friends. Her phone had been turned off, she had left no more posts on social media, and she had not responded to any messages. It was only then that the police began investigating the disappearance, but precious time was irretrievably lost. Agnes' friends and family began to post flyers all over the city with her picture and requests for help in the search. The story was also picked up by the media, featured on television news programs, and Agnes' pictures were on the front pages of local newspapers. The first leads and clues emerged after the police studied the footage from the CCTV cameras located inside and outside the entertainment venue. However, there were also some problems with this because all the files had already been erased by that time, and the police had to ask for help from specialists in order to restore them. But the efforts were not in vain, and on one of the recordings, made by a camera located at the exit to the parking lot, it was seen how Agnes, around 6 o'clock in the morning, leaves the club with a man, and does it clearly not of her own free will. This last footage, which showed Clavina alive, was to be studied in detail, but the closer the experts looked at them, the more frightening they seemed. Agnes was being led by a man of large build, and it was obvious that she was walking with him under compulsion, because he was holding her tightly by the waist. Agnes looked frightened, tried to break free several times and said something emotionally, but her companion persistently led her to the parking lot, where he literally forced her into his Mercedes S63 with tinted windows. At the moment when the big man was pushing her into the cabin, it was visible that another man was already inside. While the first man was heading for the driver's seat, Agnes managed to open the car door, after which she tried to get out and escape, but at that moment, the doorman who was standing next to her came up, and the driver gestured and said something. The doorman pushed Agnes back into the car, after which the driver handed him something, apparently a cash reward for his help. About 6 minutes after Agnes was in the car, her phone was switched off and was never switched on again. It was also impossible to trace the further movement of the vehicle, because there were no CCTV cameras along the way. It became obvious that the men who were in the cabin were the last to contact the missing beauty. Surprisingly, the case was given a high level of secrecy from the start. Everyone involved in the investigation signed non-disclosure documents, and information was not only kept out of the press, but even Agnes' loved ones were hardly ever given any information. For the first few months, parents and fiancé were kept in the dark. They were only told that the investigation was underway and that it was too early to draw any conclusions, but judging by the fact that Agnes had not given any information about herself during this time, there was little hope that she was still alive. Michael periodically gave interviews in which he asked for help in finding his fiancée, but no one ever responded to his requests. Only 6 months later, the relatives were shown the very footage from the club cameras, as well as the names of all 3 men who had last contacted Agnes. The large man who had forcibly taken the young woman out of the club and pushed her into the car was identified as Wesley Capper, the son of a well-known British millionaire and a very powerful man. In the passenger compartment of the car sat his longtime buddy named Craig Porter, who had no particular occupation and was periodically on the police's radar. The third was a dark-skinned doorman whose name was Sion Usman. Porter and Usman stated unanimously under interrogation that they were innocent, that Agnes had gotten into the car voluntarily. According to Capper, he and a friend spotted the beautiful blonde in a club and approached her to get acquainted. She was allegedly already pretty drunk, which contradicts the testimony of her friends, but didn't refuse a drink when they bought her a drink. Wesley then proposed to continue the party at his luxurious house in the country, to which Agnes agreed. Already in the car, Agnes allegedly changed her mind about going to the private party at Wesley's house and asked to be dropped off in the middle of the road, saying she would take a cab and go to her home. The man claimed to have dropped the passenger off where she asked, which was an unlit stretch of road that soon turned out to have no CCTV cameras either. But Craig Porter could neither confirm nor deny the words of Wesley Capper, because he himself, according to his confession, was also very drunk, and did not even understand when and how Agnes was in their car. Moreover, he stated that he fell asleep as soon as they drove away from the parking lot, and when he woke up, the young woman was no longer in the cabin. The third suspect, the doorman Sion Usman, also said that Agnes Clavina was drunk, but could not answer the question whether she had gotten into the car voluntarily. He did, however, confirm that when the car touched down, the blonde opened the door and almost fell out as she was driving. Then the doorman, at the request of the driver, slammed the door, for which he received a substantial tip. When Sion Usman was asked whether he thought it was strange that the woman had tried to escape by jumping out of the car while walking, he said he didn't think it was an escape attempt. In his opinion, she could have accidentally opened the door because she was intoxicated. He also added that Agnes did not scream or ask for help. The footage clearly showed Wesley Capper forcefully leading Agnes to the car, holding her by the waist and wrist. Wesley's defense was that Agnes was dizzy and he was holding her down so that she would not fall. Some time later, the investigation came across another curious, but also strange and frightening video, which was made in Soragrande in the south of Spain, in the port of Puerto de la Duquesa. The luxury yacht of John Capper, a millionaire who was the father of one of the suspects, was moored there. The footage, dated September 10th, for days after Agnes's disappearance, shows Wesley, Craig, and two other men boarding the yacht. They were carrying a large suitcase which, judging from the footage, was quite weighty, as well as a rolled-up carpet. When the company returned to the port of Puerto de la Duquesa a few days later, they had no luggage with them. After the footage was shown to Capper, he claimed that he and his friends had sailed to Ibiza to have fun. The suitcase, he said, contained their belongings, and what the investigation mistook for a carpet was bedding. Where it all subsequently went, he could not explain. A thorough search of Wesley's yacht and automobile yielded no results. As it turned out, both had been cleaned and dry-cleaned, destroying any traces of DNA. However, a long blonde hair was found in the trunk of the car, but it was not possible to establish its origin, because this crucial evidence mysteriously evaporated during the investigation. At the trial, the prosecution told another curious detail. As it turned out, a few hours after Agnes was in the defendant's car, Capper called the emergency services several times, but each time he dropped the call without waiting for an answer, as if he was afraid or doubted the correctness of his actions. The man himself explained that he was drunk and made the randomly. The lawyer for the Clavin family stated that Agnes, in his opinion, was long dead, and that her body was resting somewhere on the seabed, in the very suitcase that the suspects had brought aboard the yacht. In addition, he believed that the case was deliberately delayed, and the criminals had plenty of time to get rid of all the evidence that could prove their guilt. Only a year and a half after Agnes's disappearance, Capper, Porter, and Usman found themselves in the dock. They were accused of holding Agnes against her will and forcing her into a car. Unfortunately, due to the lack of evidence, there was nothing more to charge them with. Moreover, the millionaire and his friend were released on bail and quietly left the courtroom. Naturally, Agnes's relatives were outraged by this, but the judge was adamant. All three men were only brought to trial again in 2019, almost 5 years after Agnes's disappearance. They still denied their guilt and insisted that Clavina had gotten into the car of her own free will. The prosecutor asked that the doorman be considered an accomplice to the crime, because he helped the defendants drive the victim away. Usman could have received a sentence of 5 years in prison for his actions. In response, he made a fiery speech, in which he said that he was among the suspects because of the lack of opportunity to hire a good lawyer, because all the money he earns he sends to a starving family in Africa. Capper and Porter's lawyers insisted that their clients were guilty only of persuading Agnes to get into the car, but not of forcing her to do so. In their opinion, the young woman was dropped off on the road as she had requested, but while she was waiting for a cab to go home, she could have been kidnapped and killed by third parties because Agnes was drunk and could not offer much resistance. The verdict of the judge surprised and angered the relatives of the missing young woman, because none of the defendants, in fact, was not punished at all. Usman was cleared of all charges. Capper was sentenced to 2 years for taking advantage of Agnes's drunken state to persuade her to get into his car, and Porter received 6 months for complicity. In reality, the men received suspended sentences and did not spend a single day in prison, but paid Agnes's family the ridiculous sum of £10,000 sterling in compensation. Clavin's family were discouraged by the decision and appealed, and then it turned out that both defendants in the case, while waiting for the court's decision, managed to break the law once again. Capper, being in a state of alcoholic and drug intoxication, knocked down a woman to death and fled the scene, and Porter and his friend, also drunk, stole a car, having previously beaten its owner to a pulp. But even for this serious crime, Capper was sentenced only to probation, thanks to the brilliantly built defense of his lawyers. He paid a large sum in compensation to the family of the woman killed under the wheels of his car, and he himself remained at large. Porter was less fortunate this time, and he still went to jail, but there is no information in public sources about the sentence he received. In 2021, almost 7 years after Agnes's disappearance, the main suspect in the case was punished. Wesley had been living an immoral lifestyle all this time, abusing alcohol and illicit substances, which had severely compromised his health. At the height of the COVID pandemic, he found himself in a hospital bed, and when he thought he had conquered the disease, he suddenly had a stroke. Capper died on July 26, 2021, in his 44th year of life. At that time, Agnes's parents filed another appeal with the court, but now the suspect can no longer be prosecuted because he is dead, no matter what the Supreme Court decides in this difficult case. An unexpected twist 9 years later. Although Agnes Klavina was never found dead or alive, she was still presumed dead sometime later. Her parents, sister, and fiancé agreed with the lawyer's version that the criminals had placed Agnes's body in a suitcase, which was subsequently loaded onto a yacht and dumped somewhere on the high seas so that it could not be found. However, in the summer of 2023, 9 years after Agnes disappeared without a trace, the case took an unexpected turn. So, in mid-June, a gardener of one of the elite golf clubs, La Quita, located in the Costa del Sol region cleaning the area, found a strange object near the coast, which, upon closer inspection, turned out to be an old, badly damaged suitcase. The man did not dare to open it himself and called the police. Inside the suitcase, law enforcers found human remains. The examination showed that the bones found belonged to a young woman whose approximate age at the time of death was 35 years old. In addition, it was also found that the suitcase with the body inside had spent about 10 years in the water before it was brought to the shore. After comparing all the facts, the police hypothesized that the body found belonged to Agnes Klavina, who disappeared 9 years ago. In order to establish this unequivocally, a number of examinations are required to compare Agnes' DNA with the remains found. At the moment, experts are working closely on this issue, but the details of the investigation have not yet been made public. If the suspicions are confirmed, it will be a reason to reopen the case and bring the surviving suspects to trial. Story 4. In most cases, addiction is not a sentence, and many former alcoholics, for example, overcome their addiction, return to normal life, build families, and help others with similar problems to overcome the crisis. This is how the story of a young woman named Nicole Pitts began, who seemed to have a whole bright life ahead of her. The investigation in this difficult case lasted 6 years before the main suspect in the murder was in the dock, and another year it took to prove in court his guilt and send the criminal to prison for as long as possible. At first glance, this crime seemed perfectly planned and thought out down to the last detail, and the criminal himself for many years believed in his impunity and lived a full life, believing that he would never be brought to justice. But it was the little things and details, which the investigation for years collected in bits and pieces, helped to put the puzzle together. And now, let's try to make sense of this convoluted story from the beginning. Who is Nicole Pitts? Nicole Pitts was born in King County, Washington, in 1973, on February 26th. She was the only common child of her parents, whose marriage broke up when the girl was still in high school. Nicole grew up an active and sociable child, played sports, and was considered a real charmer. She always had a lot of friends. She loved trips out of town to the countryside, and the favorite place of rest of the girl was Lake Sammamish, located east of Seattle, where she was every year during the summer vacations. After graduating from high school, the girl went to Western Washington College, where she studied public relations. In parallel, Nicole continued to actively participate in sports, was in excellent physical shape, and decided to turn her hobby into a source of profit. She got a job as a trainer at a local sports club, where she quickly gained the respect of her colleagues and also gained regular clients who willingly attended group classes, where Nicole was an instructor. In parallel, Pitts decided to get a higher education in the field of management, and after she got a job in a large mobile communications company. Outwardly, she was always friendly, sociable, and ready to help at any moment, but almost no one even guessed how much pain and misery was hidden behind a screen of apparent well-being, harmful addiction. As a teenager, Nicole experienced a serious crisis when her parents divorced. For a fragile yet to the end of the unformed psyche, it was a great shock, and rebellious character and bad company turned out that Nicole began to hide from problems, pouring them with alcohol. All this led to a serious addiction that lasted several years, and thoroughly undermined Nicole's physical and mental health. At that time, Nicole's mother Gail worked as a stewardess and was almost constantly absent from home because of her busy work schedule. So she did not notice in time that something wrong was happening to her only daughter. The girl lived with an elderly grandmother, who also did not immediately realize that her granddaughter regularly consumes alcohol. When the truth was revealed, alcohol addiction has already managed to do irreparable damage. To cope with the problem, Nicole was helped by her mother Gail, with whom they have always been very close, despite everything. She not only sent her daughter to therapy, but also attended AA meetings with her, helping her to open up and overcome her cravings for alcohol. By then, Gail had remarried, and her new boyfriend, Rod, was sympathetic. He supported her stepdaughter in every way possible, loved her like his own daughter, and believed that she could overcome her addiction. Nicole approached therapy responsibly, did not miss a single meeting, and quickly enough was able to overcome her addiction. However, as I said, alcohol took a toll on Nicole's health. She developed serious problems with her pancreas, so much so that she had to undergo surgery. But the worst thing, alcohol abuse at such a young age violated the reproductive functions of the body, so that Pitts could not have children. In the mid-90s, when Nicole overcame addiction and returned to a sober life, she met her future spouse, whose name was David. At that time, she just got a job at a sports club, and David was his regular visitor. A tall, handsome young man who carefully watched himself and did not miss any training, immediately liked Nicole. In turn, he also paid attention to the attractive coach and began to show interest in her. True, David was 4 years younger than Nicole, but the age difference did not embarrass them. Soon between them began a romantic relationship that lasted almost 8 years, and only in 2002 the couple married. They arranged a beautiful but modest wedding ceremony in Hawaii, to which were invited only the closest people to them. After the wedding, the newlyweds settled in the quiet town of Linwood, in Washington state, where they bought their own house and gradually settled down. Nicole was a very sociable and friendly young woman. She quickly made friends, and she also developed good relationships with all the neighbors. She simply adored animals and had several dogs. Since she could not have children, she gave all her unspent maternal love to her pets. According to neighbors' memories, David and Nicole looked like the perfect married couple. They were practically inseparable, often walking their dogs together and just glowing with happiness. Nicole loved to cook, and she was very good at it. She pampered a delicious home-cooked food spouse, and also liked to surprise the guests who came to their house with her culinary skills. In 2006, just a few days before her 33rd birthday, Nicole mysteriously disappeared. On that day, for the first time, she did not come to the meeting of the AA Society, where she was the leader and inspirer of the group. Since this had never happened before, the other members of the group thought she had snapped after almost 9 years of sobriety. Pitts also didn't show up for work that day, which worried her coworkers, and in the evening the alarm was sounded by Gail, who couldn't contact her daughter all day, which had never happened before. She called David to find out what had happened, but her son-in-law replied that he couldn't reach his spouse either. According to her husband, he and Nicole had had a bit of a fight the day before, so when he tried to call her the next day and she didn't answer the phone, he assumed that Nicole was still mad at him. It was for this reason that David didn't start looking for her right away, but waited until the evening to ask his wife for forgiveness. When in the evening Nicole did not come home and her phone was still unanswered, the family decided to go to the police, but their application was not immediately accepted. The missing person was an adult, and not even a day had passed since her disappearance. So the police said that there was no cause for concern. For this reason, the search was not started until the evening of the second day, because Nicole never showed up and her phone was unavailable. The police decided to start the search from the place where Nicole was last seen, namely from her and David's house. However, no clues or anything unusual could be found there that would indicate that Pitts had been kidnapped or something had been done to her in that very room. In addition, Pitts was missing along with her personal automobile, which suggested that she had simply left and decided not to return. From here arose the first version, according to which the young woman, after a family quarrel with her husband, simply decided to leave him or teach him a lesson, making him worry. The second version was voiced by Nicole's friends from a support group for people with alcohol addiction. In their opinion, Nicole could have snapped after years of abstinence and sobriety. In favor of this hypothesis was the fact that recently she had been taking strong painkillers, which she was prescribed because of a back injury and her pain. Nicole often exceeded her prescribed dosage and at some point may have switched from medication to alcohol. The third version was the worst of all possible options. Nicole did not return and did not give any news about herself because she was no longer alive. However, the family members of the missing person to the end refused to believe it and hoped for the best. Her mother and stepfather did not wait for the police to wait for the necessary time and began the search themselves. They appealed to all concerned people through social networks with a request to help in the search and share any relevant information about the location of their daughter. They also took the first flight to Linwood, where they began searching for their daughter on their own, putting up flyers with her photos and asking people who knew her personally. The police searched not only for Nicole, but also for her car, while trying to establish which route it had traveled on that fateful day. But the longer the search lasted, the faster the hope of finding Nicole alive faded. The worst assumptions came true a few days later, when in one of the local park areas, a man going for a morning jog came across the body of a young woman. That day, he decided to take a shortcut through an unpopular and neglected area rather than his usual route. There he noticed something strange in the shrubbery, and coming closer, he realized that it was a badly mutilated naked female body. Information about the terrible find was immediately transferred to the police, and the criminalists who arrived on the scene suggested that the crime may have involved violence, because the body of a young woman had no clothes. There was no doubt that it was a murder, and judging by the number of bruises, abrasions and bruises, the victim had been severely beaten beforehand. The cause of death was asphyxiation. Nicole was strangled with her bare hands. It was a truly gruesome picture. As the car of the victim was still not found, investigators assumed that the main motive of the crime was theft, but the attacker decided to eliminate a witness, and since it was a young woman, she may also have been abused. The police immediately assumed that the body found belonged to Nicole Pitts, who had disappeared a few days ago and was being searched for all over the city, but she had yet to be identified by her family. When Gail saw her daughter's body in the morgue, she lost her senses. The mother needed medical help. Her husband Rod was also out of grief, but the reaction of the widowed spouse, many seemed a little strange. David did not look depressed at all, and his emotions were somewhat faked. However, then no one paid much attention to it because everyone experiences tragedy in his own way. While the search for the vehicle was underway, the police still believed that the car was the main target of the attacker, and the traces of the killer should be sought inside the car. Information about the missing car was placed in the media with a request to anyone who sees the car to immediately report it to the hotline. The car was found only a couple of weeks later in one of the parking lots on the outskirts of the city. The unremarkable gray Volkswagen Polo was noticed by the guard on duty, because the car had not been taken away for a long time, but the guard had no idea that it was involved in a murder case. The police immediately took the car for detailed examination and necessary expertise. It was assumed that it was here that they would be able to find evidence and important clues that would help to trace the criminal, as well as to restore the picture of the crime. However, the investigators were completely disappointed. In the car could not be found exactly nothing. There was no blood, traces of struggle, or signs that the car owner was taken somewhere by force. In the cabin there were fingerprints and traces of DNA only Nicole herself, as well as her husband, who also occasionally used the vehicle. Nevertheless, the investigators were not in a hurry to return the car to David, because they felt that the evidence is there, they just do not lie on the surface. The irrefutable fact remained only that the young woman was killed with particular cruelty, but the motive of the crime was completely unclear. The hijacking version now seemed untenable, because the car was abandoned almost immediately on the other side of the city, and there were no signs of struggle inside it. The second obvious motive was violence, but this assumption was not confirmed. Experts found that the deceased, at least a day before the crime, had no sexual contacts, neither voluntary nor forced, but in this case, the question remained open as to why she had no clothes on. The third version was some personal motive, or acute, unpleasant feelings of the perpetrator towards the victim. In favor of this assumption spoke numerous injuries, inflicted as if in a fit of rage. However, The kind and sociable Nicole, eager to help everyone around her, had no enemies or ill-wishers. This difficult case had all chances to remain unsolved, because after almost a year, the investigation has no new leads or directions for the search for the criminal. No one saw the code, and who abandoned the car in the parking lot because the place itself was not crowded, and there were no surveillance cameras in the area. But what was strange was that the person driving the car was much taller and larger than the victim, as evidenced by the position of the driver's seat. Suspicious was also the fact that the case was assigned the status of secrecy, and information about the course of the investigation, as well as about new facts and found evidence, was not disclosed even to the relatives of the victim. That is, the mother, stepfather, and husband, in fact, were in the dark. They received only fragmentary information, for example, that Nicole's bank card was used at a certain gas station in the country after her disappearance. The police requested the footage from the video cameras there, but what they saw on them remained a mystery. Nicole's parents, despairing that there were no results, and their daughter's killer was still at large, decided to conduct an independent investigation on their own. To do this, they hired a private detective to gather all the information and verify some of their guesses, and announced a reward of $10,000 for those who provide any useful information on the subject. The reward was later increased to $35,000, but it still didn't help move the case forward. David only showed interest in the investigation for the first 6 months, but after that he gradually withdrew, stopped communicating with his mother-in-law and father-in-law, and soon remarried and had an heir. For Gail, this news was a heavy blow, because her daughter could not have children, and David constantly reproached his wife for this. The grief-stricken mother repeatedly suggested that the culprit could be her son-in-law, but many believed that in her speaks resentment, and the police seemed not to consider such a version at all. An unexpected twist in the case, it wasn't until 6 years after the crime that it was revealed that David had been taken into custody as the prime suspect in the case. For most people who followed the investigation, such a turn was a complete surprise, but not for Nicole's family and friends, who from the beginning suspected him and openly talked about it. During the long years of investigation, they seemed disappointed in justice, but now justice had been served. David himself, who by that time had changed his place of residence and stopped contact with his first wife's family, was discouraged when the handcuffs were snapped on his wrists, because he thought that the case had long been closed and no one was looking for the criminal. He categorically denied his guilt and even agreed to take a lie detector test, which he failed miserably. As it turned out, the police also from the beginning suspected David, but no hard evidence proving his guilt, they had no, and to scare the criminal and make him hide, they did not want to. So all these years, the investigators were busy with the fact that the pieces of evidence to collect, so that the culprit was deserved punishment. David himself probably thought he had committed the perfect crime and no one would ever get on his trail. However, the crime had a number of oddities, each of which had to be checked. Let's start perhaps with the surveillance footage at the same gas station where someone paid with the card of the dead Nicole. The footage clearly showed that the card was used by a man who looked very much like David, but it was impossible to identify him clearly because of the presence of a headdress and dark glasses. Despite the fact that this recording could not be considered as incontrovertible evidence, it was still included in the case file. The second oddity was the absence of Nicole's wedding ring, without which she never left the house. At first, everyone thought that the jewelry was stolen by a criminal, but during the search in the victim's house, the ring was found in a box on the dressing table. In addition, experts criminalists, during the examination of the body, found in Nicole's mouth a special dental mouthguard, which she used during sleep to prevent bruxism, teeth grinding. Nicole had been prescribed this device shortly before the tragedy because she was experiencing uncontrollable spasms of her masticatory muscles due to nervousness, which in turn led to the erosion of enamel and chipping of teeth. This finding led the investigation to believe that the victim had been killed in her own bed while she was still asleep. This explained the lack of clothing on her and the fact that the body was completely clean and there were no signs of resistance. There was also no trace of makeup on Nicole's face, which she always carefully applied before leaving the house. About the mouthguard, by the way, David could simply forget because his wife began to use it recently. In addition, experts have studied in detail and assessed the position of the driver's seat in the found car, finding that the anthropometric data of the last person who sat behind the wheel coincide with the data of the spouse of the murdered. In addition, in the car, as already mentioned, found fingerprints only David and Nicole. If a third person had been in the cabin, there would have been found his traces, and if he erased them, then erased traces and prints of the owners of the car. And one more important discovery was made thanks to the rapid development of technology. The perpetrator, after his crime, in an attempt to confuse the investigation, several times used the victim's phone in different parts of the city, but in the same places, and at the same time there was a signal from David's phone. As it turned out, David also had a motive, and in this perfect-looking family, a serious crisis was long overdue. While Nicole was studying hard, working 2 jobs, and helping people cope with their addiction, her husband led an idle lifestyle. He never held down a job for long, liked to spend time in bars and clubs, where he spent his wife's earnings on booze and other women. As a result, the family faced serious financial problems, which only worsened over time. Nicole tried to persuade her husband to take the mind, to give up partying and start attending AA meetings, where he would help him cope with addiction. But in response, David only laughed, called his wife terribly boring and complex. It also turned out that David not only systematically cheated on his wife with various random mistresses, but also repeatedly offered her to join them. Nicole always responded with an emphatic refusal, and once her husband tried to get her drunk to force her to do it. Gail knew about all the horrors that were going on in her daughter's family and tried to convince her to leave her husband, but she did not want to do it, because she loved him and hoped that David would change. And after Nicole's mysterious death, her husband rushed to get a large insurance payment and immediately started a new affair. As it turned out, a few months before the tragedy, David, who had not been faithful before, had an affair with a girl named Jane. He spent time with her in bars and clubs, while his wife was busy working or studying. Shortly before Nicole's birthday, he brought his mistress straight home, where they were caught by the suddenly returned Nicole. It was this circumstance that became the cause of that very family quarrel. Nicole told her mother about the incident, with whom she was very close, and a couple of days later she mysteriously disappeared. Since Gail was aware of everything that was going on, she suspected her son-in-law from the beginning. However, the police insisted that the evidence gathered was too little to send the suspect to jail. Then the case was classified, and the family stopped receiving any information about the investigation, and over the years, the parents lost all hope that the culprit will be punished. By the way, when David received an impressive insurance payout after his wife's death, he spent that money with Jane. Gail suggested that David's mistress could be an accomplice or inspirer of the crime, but she was only brought in as a witness because no evidence proving her involvement was found during the investigation. David appeared before the court in September 2013, but he continued to categorically deny his involvement in the tragedy. His defense lawyers initially insisted that all the evidence against their client was circumstantial and could not unequivocally prove his guilt. When it became apparent that there were too many incriminating factors, the defense changed tactics, trying to make David look like a victim. The story of pain pills that Nicole took after her back injury was brought up, and the lawyers also tried to convince the court that Nicole snapped and started drinking alcohol again, making her husband's life unbearable. But first, such claims were baseless, and everyone who knew Nicole confirmed this. And secondly, even if she had snapped, it would not have given David any right to kill his wife, and even with such cruelty. The guilt of the defendant was eventually fully proven, and for his crime, he received the maximum possible sentence provided by the laws of the state in which the case was heard. David went to prison for 18 years. However, in 2025, he can count on parole after serving 2/3 of his sentence. Story 5. On the far reaches of the Aegean Sea, where the horizon seems endless and the water stretches all the way to the sky, the Royal Caribbean was moving. George Smith and Jennifer, a young couple who had just become husband and wife, stood on deck, feeling the wind in their hair and contemplating this majestic nature. The Aegean Sea spread out before them like a vast life full of promise and plans. Thus began their wedding journey, which became not an ordinary cruise, but a story turned into a mystery. On July 5, 2005, around 8 a.m. on Deck 7, in one of the cabins of the cruise ship Royal Caribbean, 16-year-old Emily Rausch of Chicago was preparing for a new sunny day. Outside her cabin window, Emily noticed something strange that caused her alarm. She saw something that looked like blood smeared across the canopy that served as a sort of shield for the lifeboat. Nearby, she also saw a bloodstain near the very edge of the canopy, as if someone, having been injured, had fallen there before disappearing overboard. Emily could not remain indifferent to this discovery and hastened to report the strange footprints to the staff of the liner. A host of other passengers from neighboring cabins also discovered these frightening signs. A lively and exciting discussion began on Deck 7 about what might have happened. Thus began a story that made front-page headlines in many international publications just days after a happy young couple embarked on their honeymoon Mediterranean cruise. The happiness of young people was suddenly cut short by an inexplicable terrible event that unfolded in cabin number 9062. The versions of what happened were varied and confusing, including an accident, possible robbery, or even premeditated murder, and the investigation became a puzzle for the police. Traces and evidence collected on board pointed to multiple suspects, each hiding their own secrets. It seems that many on the liner knew far more than they were willing to say. What really happened that dark night on board? That is the question that detectives, journalists, and all those following this mysterious story are asking themselves. George Smith was a cheerful, inquisitive, and bright young man. He was born in the small town of Greenwich, Connecticut. His childhood was a happy one, filled with the joy and support of his family, which came first for George, and he always maintained a close relationship with his parents and his sister Bree. His father, George Smith Sr., owned a liquor store and ran it himself. The family business was not just a job for him, but a true passion. In 2000, the younger George Smith successfully completed his higher education in business at Babson College, which is located in Massachusetts. After graduation, he worked for several years in Boston as a computer data mining analyst. However, his heart has always belonged to the family business. After making an informed decision, George decided to return home to help his parents run the store. Under his father's guidance, he was going to learn the ins and outs of the family business so that he could take over the store in the future and allow his parents to enjoy a well-deserved vacation. In 2002, at one of his reunions with friends, George Smith met a girl who became his life partner. Jennifer was also a Connecticut native and had just received a job offer as an elementary school teacher. She was bright, beautiful, and ambitious, just like George himself. The young people were completely enamored with each other. George's parents were also delighted with his chosen one. 3 years later, in 2005, when George was 26 years old, the couple decided to get married and start a new chapter of their lives. They celebrated their wedding at the Castle Hill Inn, located in the picturesque town of Newport, Rhode Island, and the ceremony itself took place on the oceanfront. It was a location perfect for such an important event in their lives. Immediately after the ceremony, the newlyweds went on a wedding trip, choosing a cruise on a luxury liner, one of the majestic ships of the Royal Caribbean. The tour, lasting 12 days, involved sailing the beautiful waters of the Aegean Sea. Their journey began in Barcelona on June 29th and included stops on France's Côte d'Azur and then along the coast of Italy. Aboard the liner, George and Jennifer quickly struck up a friendship with another couple and a young man named Askin from California. 20-year-old Josh Askin, a man with a keen sense of humor, quickly won George's friendship, and onwards the merry company enjoyed spending time together. The 1st of July, when the liner moored off the Italian coast, they decided to go on land together and have fun. All day July, 04 young people traveled around the island, walked through the narrow streets of its old town, swam in the cleanest Aegean Sea, and tasted the local cuisine and cozy taverns. Happy and cheerful, they enjoyed each other and the atmosphere of this beautiful place. Mykonos left unforgettable memories in their hearts, and they planned to also have fun continuing this evening together on the deck of the liner. After a romantic dinner, George and Jennifer met up with their friends again on the liner. The merry company decided to unite and have a good laugh to remember this exotic corner of the world. The evening was full of laughter and excitement. After enjoying delicious appetizers and drinks, the newlyweds, in the company of Josh Askin, went to have fun in the casino on board the liner. George and Josh enjoyed sitting at the craps table. They were also kept entertained during the game, while Jennifer enjoyed playing at the poker table. By the end of the evening, the newlyweds had lost a not insignificant amount of money without regret. They joked about losing. After all, it was their honeymoon. After the casino closed, apparently, the friends decided to continue their night out. The last video of George was recorded around 2:30 a.m. on one of the liner's many security cameras. The footage showed him leaving the casino, but that did not mean George would return to his cabin. In the early morning hours of June 5, 2005, on the Greek island of Mykonos, a mysterious plot began to unfold. George Smith, 26, a newlywed who was on an Aegean cruise with his wife Jennifer, disappeared. Last night, George was reportedly having an active time enjoying the liner's atmosphere of fun and luxury. Everything seemed harmless that night, but the sequel turned out to be much darker. The captain of the ship examined the cabin under the window of which strange footprints had been found, as well as the place on deck. There was no one in the cabin. The available footprints and evidence indicated that something serious had happened. The possible disappearance of the newlyweds was related to violence. The news quickly reached all the liner's visitors. There was alarm aboard the ship. Passengers were disturbed by the strange events. Deck 7 was cordoned off. No one was let in or out of their cabins. The ship's crew thoroughly checked every possible establishment on the liner in hopes of finding the missing George and Jennifer. After the discovery of blood, the newlyweds were presumed to have mysteriously disappeared. Taking the situation into his own hands, the senior officer headed to their stateroom to get to the bottom of what was going on. From all available traces, it was hypothesized that George might have fallen overboard the ship. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ship, the search for the young couple was still going on. By 10 a.m., Jennifer was found in the ship spa, where she was having a pre-booked massage session. Her facial expression spoke of deep surprise and concern. She claimed to be unaware of her husband's whereabouts, and that she had not seen him since the previous night. Jennifer revealed that when she woke up this morning, her husband wasn't there. At first, it did not seem unusual to her because he had spent the night with friends and in the morning he was in another cabin. So she did not search for her husband but went for a spa treatment without being bothered by his absence. At noon, Turkish authorities arrived on board to begin an investigation. The ship's captain reassured the anxious passengers and announced that the abnormal events required cooperation with local authorities. He emphasized that it was a measure necessary to clarify the circumstances and expressed hope that the situation would be resolved soon. The police officers began their questioning with the missing man's wife, Jennifer. Her agitated state and apparent lack of information about her husband made her the main suspect. She said that she had not seen George since the previous night, and that men in white uniforms from the Royal Caribbean had shown up at her door announcing that her husband may have fallen overboard the ship. They also noticed traces of blood on the boat's awning, after which there was no room for doubt. Something terrible had happened to George. Investigators scrutinized cabin 9062 on the cruise ship. This cabin was a mess. Perhaps it was the result of a hurried search or even a struggle. In the bathroom, small drops of blood were found on the carpet and towel, and there were fingerprints on the balcony railing. Turkish investigators also found 2 small bloodstains on the bedding, each about 2 centimeters long. These samples were identified. The blood belonged to George. All evidence indicated that George had been traumatized inside the cabin before his mysterious disappearance. The investigators' attention was particularly drawn to a chair on the balcony, which had been moved so that it was possible to sit next to the railing. They found marks on the railing as if someone had sat on it. This raised suspicion among many, including the ship's captain, that George might have fallen from the balcony. But the high railing and the presence of blood, both on the boat's awning and inside the cabin, also raised suspicion of a murder that had occurred. Investigators began reconstructing the sequence of events that night, trying to figure out who George was spending time with and what might have led to this tragedy. The investigation was just beginning, but it was already obvious that they were facing a complex and dark story, full of mysteries and unexpected twists and turns. When the Turkish authorities entered the ship to begin investigating the disappearance of George Smith, they decided to start by questioning the company of boys with whom the newlyweds had spent time the previous night. The situation remained mysterious, and every detail could be important in solving the mystery. Members of the company revealed that George and Jennifer had consumed too much alcohol that tragic night. According to them, George was intoxicated, and they helped him back to his cabin where they put him to bed, removed his shoes, and left him alone. They also reported that they could not find Jennifer, and assumed that she had returned to the cabin later. However, there are a number of discrepancies in Josh Askin's testimony. Specifically, he claimed that he saw Jennifer leave with a casino employee named Lloyd. Josh believed that there was a passionate connection between the two of them, and they didn't even hide their feelings in George's presence, but video camera footage showed that at 3:30 a.m., Jennifer stumbled away, leaving George with her new friends, and Lloyd's key card data indicated that he returned to his cabin at 3:25 a.m., which was confirmed by his girlfriend, whom he woke up upon entering the cabin. These discrepancies raised further questions for investigators, and led them to believe that Josh Askin may have had his own motives for hiding some important details. The investigation continued, and each new detail added more and more mystery to the story. Greg Rosenberg, a young man of 19, was enjoying a cruise on a liner with his family and friends. In this company were his cousin, Zach Rosenberg, and a close friend, Rostislav Kaufman. All three, despite their Russian roots, held American passports and lived in New York City. The fun began in the casino, where Jennifer and Greg Rosenberg decided to try their luck at poker. The mutual gambling lasted until late at night, and when the casino closed at 2:30 a.m., the group of guys decided to continue the fun together. They headed to the disco, continuing to dance and enjoy alcohol. Lloyd Bota, the casino manager, was also spotted in their company. He joined in the fun as the young men continued their nightly entertainment. Next, the events of the night, as described by the witnesses, begin to diverge as the individual members of the group begin to gradually disperse to their cabins. Already deep into the night, the boys were visibly drunk and rowdy. According to the rules of order on the ship, it was decided to block the delivery for such people who are loud and behave inappropriately, and when the staff of the liner refused to serve two drunken visitors, the young people remembered that they had with them a bottle of absinthe, purchased on a walk on the island of Mykonos. However, cruise passengers were forbidden to drink their own alcohol. At a certain point, Josh returns to his cabin, which was on the same deck, to retrieve a special bottle of absinthe that he said he had plans for. As it later turns out, the absinthe was unusually strong, with an alcohol concentration of over 70%, making it one of the strongest drinks available. George decides to help his friend and hides the bottle behind the waistband of his shorts. After 3 o'clock in the morning, when the liner was already completely quiet, an observant janitor noticed something unusual. A group of young men, including Greg, Zach, Rostislav, Josh, and George, were drinking their bottle of absinthe. This circumstance did not go unnoticed, and it became another element in the investigation. However, it wasn't just the guys who were drunk that evening. Jennifer, who had seemed relatively sober and calm at the beginning of the evening, began to change noticeably. She began to stagger, and at one point, even leaned on the casino manager, Lloyd. Her behavior gave different impressions to witnesses. Some thought she was trying to keep her balance, while others saw it as flirting. It also remains unclear what happened afterward between the young spouses. According to witnesses, there was a conflict between the couple. Perhaps they were just discussing the previous evening, and jokingly or seriously, but at some point Jennifer hit George. It was unclear whether this happened in a playful manner, or perhaps in anger. After that, Jennifer left the disco. At about 3:30 a.m., Jennifer, stumbling and visibly intoxicated, left the place of entertainment, leaving George in the company of his new friends. This moment was the turning point that night. The testimony of staff witnesses proved pivotal in uncovering the details of the incident. Jennifer, walking staggering down the hallway, attracted the attention of the janitor, who had earlier noticed the young men enjoying their absinthe. He gave her support, helped her to the elevator, and watched her turn right when she reached her deck. However, there was a strange discrepancy. Her stateroom was on the left, but she headed in the opposite direction. Jennifer was later found sleeping in the hallway, far from her room. 2 guards and a female duty officer used a wheelchair to get her back to her quarters. When they got there, the clock was already showing 4:52 a.m., but George wasn't there. The curtains on the balcony doors were drawn tightly, and they remained stationary, even with the breeze. This raised questions. Was George able to go out to the balcony on his own after his new friends left him in bed? Deputy Chief of Police Chit Hyman and his wife were resting in a neighboring cabin and witnessed the unfolding events. The couple had been asleep for quite some time, but at 4 a.m. they were suddenly awakened by a noise on their floor. They first heard loud noises from stateroom number 9062, where the newlyweds were staying. Chit Hyman immediately called guest services to report the noise. He also pounded on the wall and yelled to his neighbors, which resulted in brief silence. Then there was loud talking again, lasting about 3 minutes, and suddenly there was a loud argument on the balcony. Chit and his wife heard someone say goodnight several times, as if trying to chase people out of the cabin. This was followed by sounds like moving furniture, and finally a loud thud, resembling the falling of an object. Chit Hyman decided to check what was going on and opened the door. He saw 3 men he could not identify. Several other passengers also reported a loud noise that sounded like a body hitting the canopy of the boat, followed by a woman's scream, but none of the eyewitnesses had conclusive evidence that a woman was inside the cabin at the time. According to witnesses, 4 young men entered the cabin, but only 3 of them were visible as they exited. The question arose, could one of them have stayed inside, trying to find money from the newlyweds, which after a generous game in the casino, may have wanted to steal intruders? The version about a failed robbery attempt seems the most plausible. However, there are alibis for the 3 boys, Greg, Zach, and Rostislav, who were allegedly in another stateroom just minutes after Chit Hyman saw the 3 unknown men. The keycard records for George's stateroom confirm that the boys entered it at 4:05 a.m., according to their testimony, and that they entered the cabin again was not recorded. Thus, there are several theories as to what may have happened to George Smith. Version 1. Robbery. The version of a possible robbery represents one of the main ones. By all appearances, George and Jennifer got drunk fairly quickly that night. But from witnesses' observations, they looked more or less sober when they left the casino at 2:30 in the morning. At 3:30 a.m., however, they were no longer able to return to their cabin on their own, suggesting possible exposure to illegal substances. This theory is supported by the testimony of other casino visitors, who claim that George and Jennifer spoke openly about having large sums of money, possibly received as wedding gifts or casino winnings. Different witnesses mentioned different amounts, but they all estimated their wealth in the tens of thousands of dollars. Of course, they could have been victims of a robbery. George wore an expensive Breitling watch, and Jennifer owned an expensive engagement ring, all of which indicated they were wealthy. Maybe their quarters were turned over looking for that money. The traces of blood on the sheet could probably have come from the kidnappers' attempt to remove George's valuable watch from his wrist. Version 2. Action of alcohol. The second version of events related to the effects of alcohol and hallucinogens. The captain, upon learning of the drunkenness of the passengers and the footprints on the balcony, concluded that there may have been an unintentional accident and, for example, during the scuffle, George fell overboard. Particular attention is paid to the question of the presence of hallucinations and their potential danger due to the ingestion of absinthe. Experts in the field of toxicology emphasize that everything depends on the concentration of the active substance, in this case thujone. Today, this drink is available for sale in many European countries, and its concentration is significantly limited by European Union regulations. This means that in officially sold absinthe, the concentration of thujone is so low that it is not capable of causing hallucinations. However, illegally made absinthe with a much higher concentration can be found on the black market, which in theory can cause hallucinations. This seems unlikely in this case, as the absinthe the Smith couple purchased was bought officially in Europe and could not have caused such effects. According to experts, to achieve hallucinogenic effects using official absinthe would require the consumption of a huge quantity. so large that it would hardly be tolerable for the body and would most likely lead to fatal alcohol intoxication. Thus, the version about the influence of alcohol and hallucinogens in this case seems unlikely and lacks convincing evidence. The interviewing of suspected company members in the George Smith disappearance case represents an important part of the investigation. FBI agents conducted polygraph interviews with several key individuals in this story, including Jennifer and casino manager Lloyd Botha. Both passed the polygraph successfully. However, Josh Askin failed the polygraph interview. This may indicate that he had some secrets regarding George's disappearance, but it is also possible that it was the result of special interrogation tactics used to get more information from him. There was also a videotape of 3 guys, including Russians, joking about what had happened. This tape proved to be important evidence, and the FBI agents took it into consideration. One of the unidentified guys on the tape uttered the phrase, "We gave him a lesson in paragliding without a parachute." This phrase may hint at some kind of incident or joke involving George. In 2009, all 4 guys, Greg, Zach, Rostislav, and Josh Askin, were interviewed by FBI agents as witnesses, as part of the investigation into the mysterious death of George Smith. Zach Rosenberg and Josh Askin refused to give direct answers and invoked the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which grants the right not to testify against oneself. Their testimony remained ambiguous, and it appears they were unwilling or unable to provide a full account of what happened. The George Smith investigation was also influenced by the testimony of Greg Rosenberg, who was among the young men who were in the company of those entertaining that night. He claimed that they ordered food to their cabin that day, which serves as a key alibi for the Russian boys. However, there are contradictions to this claim. Records in the ship's service logs do not support such orders, and the delivery service had been blocked for their cabin the day before. The staff was even instructed not to provide any service to them that night. Greg cannot say for sure which of the cabin's passengers placed the orders. When asked about the nature of the relationship between George and Jennifer, witnesses gave different answers based on their observations and recollections. Greg claimed that because of the heavy alcohol consumption, it was difficult to determine how good the relationship between the newlyweds was. He emphasized that everyone in the group was highly intoxicated. From his testimony, it was impossible to draw definite conclusions about the nature of their relationship. Josh Askin provided information that Greg left the cabin after ordering food. However, Greg denied this claim, stating that he never left. These contradictions made the investigation even more complex and required further verification and fact-finding. What was important in Greg's words was that he had no information about whether Jennifer or Lloyd Botha were involved in George's disappearance, but he insists that the event was not accidental. The young man claimed that something crazy happened that night that will be revealed to everyone sooner or later. In December 2019, Greg Rosenberg was murdered, and his death also remains unsolved. Police are looking into a possible link between his murder and the death of George Smith. The mysterious disappearance of George Smith became a real mystery that cast a shadow on his family. The situation became more and more complicated, and the behavior of the relatives after this tragedy attracted the attention of both the public and law enforcement agencies. The Smith family continued to press the authorities, demanding that the truth and justice be revealed. The case of George's disappearance was transferred from the FBI's Connecticut Regional Office to the FBI's New York office. Their persistence, and more importantly, their ability to get the public's attention through the media, yielded little results. To try to solve this dark secret, the family offered a $100,000 reward for information that could help find and punish those responsible. They also called for a boycott of the shipowners' company, which they believed was trying to cover up the incident to keep profits. The relationship between the parents and George's young wife, Jennifer, was disrupted. After the incident, a thorough review of her behavior began. Publicly, she seemed too collected, too measured. Her reticence and unwillingness to share enough information raised suspicion. She claimed to be following the instructions of FBI agents and doing only what she was told. The Smith family, in their search for justice and truth, eventually lost faith in Jennifer when she accepted an offer from the judgment company to settle the lawsuit independently for $1 million. The move seemed to them like a betrayal and an escape from further allegations against the cruise organizers. The Smith family was disappointed by the lack of transparency in the Turkish authorities' investigation and felt that Jennifer was too quick to accept the offer. They were convinced that Jennifer was hiding something and was not showing the proper interest in finding out what had happened. Jennifer herself claimed that she remembered almost nothing from that night after 2:30 a.m. and was not even aware that the liner's staff had found her in the corridor and returned her to her cabin. The Turkish investigation has not satisfied the Smith family and their belief in justice. Skeptical of the official findings, they decided to take justice into their own hands and enlisted the help of independent forensic scientist, Henry Lee. Henry Lee conducted a series of studies in the cabin and on the balcony, the work of which was not included in the official investigation. These investigations would reveal key information about what had happened and could confirm one of the two main versions of events: murder or accident. According to Henry Lee, the height of the balcony makes a fall from it unproven. It could have been the result of a third party pushing George, or, being in some insane state, he could have climbed up on the chair by himself and fallen. Nevertheless, the latter version raised many questions and doubts. The expert intended to conduct an experiment with a dummy to simulate a fall from the balcony, but the company owner of the liner refused this request. George's relatives claim that this decision was made to hinder their attempts to establish the truth. Henry Lee also conducted investigations in the cabin, on the balcony, and on the boat, but the results of these investigations remained unavailable to the public. At the same time, the FBI stepped in and began conducting their own investigation. Many of their findings and discoveries also remain secret. Obviously, the FBI's focus was on the 4 young men who spent the night with George, Josh Askin, and the 3 Russians, Greg, Zach Rosenberg, and Rostislav Kaufman. Their testimony was largely inconsistent with that of the other witnesses, making the situation strange and confusing. The story of George Smith's disappearance continues to be a deep mystery, shrouded in mystery and unknown circumstances. With a lengthy investigation and many theories, the Smith family and his loved ones continue to strive to find out the truth. They initially suspected Jennifer, but then were able to be convinced of her innocence and increased the payout amount of the lawsuit against the company. This amount was divided among the family, and they secured the release of the results of the investigation of the ship owner's company, including witness statements and other information. Jennifer was left with memories of her first husband and dedicated herself to charitable organizations in his memory, striving to do good. Several years later, she remarried. Despite the FBI's efforts and long investigations, they never found out what really happened or where George's body was located. Eventually, the case was closed and the incident was ruled an accident. The FBI determined that there was not enough evidence to continue the investigation. So says the official statement of the Federal Bureau. The mystery of George Smith's disappearance remains unsolved. His family remains in search of answers as to the cause of his death. The inability to honor George's memory at his grave is agonizing for his loved ones, and they remain hopeful that sooner or later they will be able to solve the mystery and finally learn the truth. Story 6. In 2012, at the Summer Olympics in London, the star of a young Puerto Rican boxer, Felix Verdejo Sanchez, shone brightly. He was called a diamond, one of the most promising athletes of his country. He was predicted to win titles and gold medals. Then it seemed to everyone that this talented and motivated young man will reach fantastic heights in sports. In 2021, the name of the boxer again traveled all the world's media, but this time fell into the section of criminal chronicles. This story is about a teenage attachment that grew into a kind of addiction and led to a terrible tragedy, and also about how the author of the main knockout of 2014, who was praised and promoted by 2-time Olympic champion Vasyl Lomachenko, almost received a death sentence but eventually went to prison for life. It is noteworthy that despite the presence of irrefutable evidence and confessions of the boxer's accomplice, he himself to this day refuses to plead guilty. The future star of world boxing was born in the Puerto Rican city of San Juan in 1993 on May 19th. He grew up in a rather modest large family and from an early age was fond of port. True, in childhood he planned to connect his life with baseball, but his further fate was determined by a funny incident. When the boy was 9 years old, a family friend came to visit them with his son of the same age. The boys were playing in the yard, but suddenly quarreled and a fight broke out. Parents separated the children, and the father of the future athlete noted that if he wants to fight with someone in the future, let him wear boxing gloves. After that fight, Felix, at his request, was taken to a local gym where the boy, as he later admitted himself, from the first training session fell in love with boxing. At the age of 16, he won the Pan American Junior Championships. A year later, he won his country's championship, and a year later, he went to the Olympic Games in London where he reached the quarterfinals. In the same year began his brilliant career in the professional ring. In total, Verdejo had 29 fights, gaining 27 confident victories, and in 2014 he was recognized as the author of the best knockout in the fight against Sergio Villanueva. A year later, Felix won his first championship belt with the WBO Latino title, which he subsequently defended 6 more times in 2 years. Everyone who saw him in the fight had no doubt this young man will write his name in the history of world boxing. And now let's get to know Kishla Rodriguez. The girl was born in November 1993 in San Juan. The full name given to her at birth is Kishla Marlene Rodriguez Ortiz. Her parents, Jose and Kayla Rodriguez, had another common daughter, Barilas Nicole, and also the couple raised Kayla's son, Jonathan, from a previous marriage of a woman. Kishla grew up an open and sociable girl. She did well in school and adored animals, dreaming of becoming a veterinarian in the future. Her best friend was her sister Barilas, to whom she confided all her secrets and worries. Kishla studied in the same school with Felix Verdejo, who was her age. Young people were acquainted since childhood, and an adolescence between them began a romantic relationship. In 2011, Rodriguez's parents divorced and separated. Kayla moved to relatives in Florida, and her daughters, who were by then already adults, decided to stay in San Juan. Despite the fact that each of the sisters had long since lived their own lives, they continued to stay in close contact and told each other about everything that was happening to them. At the age of 18, a promising boxer, who has already managed to take part in the Olympic Games, had an affair with a young schoolgirl and aspiring model, Elisa Maria Santiago Sierra. At that time, the girl was only 14 years old, and she was still in school, but even then she made big plans for the future with a promising and world-famous athlete. In addition, Elisa's parents were not at all against this relationship. Attractive and talented Felix, who has always had a lot of fans, becoming a boxing star, literally bathed in the rays of fame, and was surrounded by female attention. He did not miss the opportunity to spin a novel or a passing affair on the side, and also, despite the serious relationship with Elisa, continued to meet with his school friend Kishla. Kishla's sister, Barilas, and her mother, Kayla Rodriguez, knew about the affair and did not approve of the relationship. In addition, the situation was very ambiguous. On the one hand, Elisa considered herself the only woman and great love of the athlete, was preparing for the wedding, and made far-reaching plans for their joint future. On the other hand, Kishla knew that the lover has a fiancé, but at the same time, Felix did not let her go. On top of that, he was her first great love, and deep down, the naive girl herself still hoped to be the one. In 2016, the boxer did marry the young Elisa, who at that time was barely 19 years old. Elisa by that time was already quite a famous model, had tens of thousands of followers in social networks, and also opened her own beauty studio for eyelash extensions. In August of the same year, just a few months after the wedding, the athlete got into a serious car accident when he was rushing on his motorcycle. He was taken to the hospital in serious condition with head injuries, bruises, and lacerations. His trainer, Ricky Marquez, seriously feared that his talented charge would go off the rails at the height of his career, but Felix, contrary to the disappointing prognosis, made a rapid recovery and soon returned to the ring. In September 2019, the boxer published in his profile in the social network a picture with Elisa, who was in a large term of pregnancy. In the comment to the photo, he wrote, "Soon I will meet my daddy's princess." And a month later, he announced the birth of a daughter, who was given the name Miranda Verdejo Santiago. The young man in public looked like a loving husband, caring father, and an exemplary family man. But secretly from his wife he continued to meet with Kishla, who could not let go. As Elisa later admitted, she guessed that her husband was cheating on her, but every time he tearfully vowed to leave his mistress. Kishla repeatedly tried to break off this painful relationship, but Felix would not let her go. She had no other men because the boxer threatened that if he found out about the fact that Kishla had someone not good for her and her chosen one, Kishla herself, who had fallen in love with Verdejo since high school, continued to love him despite everything. Rodriguez, as planned, connected her life with the care of animals and got a job at the Center of Veterinary Medicine and Aesthetics. Colleagues described her as conscientious, hardworking, and very responsible. She lived with 2 dogs and a cat, which she simply adored. In 2020, Elisa discovered the correspondence of her husband with several mistresses, including Kishla. The wife gave her husband a scandal and threw him out of the house, threatening that she would file for divorce and forbid him to see his daughter. Elisa's threats had an effect. In addition, in the career of the athlete at that time, there was a serious decline and unnecessary problems where he did not need. For a while, he really stopped seeing Rodriguez, but Felix still did not let her go, trying to control almost every step Kishla. After a few months of secret visits resumed, and in April 2021, Kishla discovered that she was pregnant. She bought a rapid test at the drugstore, which only confirmed her fears. She first called her sister, who was aware of her complicated relationship with the athlete, and told her everything. It was out of the question to have abortion because Kishla was already 27 years old, and she was ready to have a child, even if she had to raise it on her own. A few days later, Kishla broke the news to the father of her child, hoping in her heart that he would accept it, but Felix was not happy, to put it mildly. He got angry and told his mistress that she should go to the doctor, and if the pregnancy is confirmed, it will be necessary to have an abortion. Naturally, Rodriguez answered him with a firm refusal, but the boxer began to threaten her and insist. Felix said that an illegitimate child will finally destroy his reputation, and this he cannot allow. After Kishla's visit to the hospital, her pregnancy was confirmed, and she now had a certificate to prove it. She called Felix and told him everything, which made him furious. Felix shouted and demanded that Kishla immediately get rid of the child, but she again responded with a categorical refusal. Then the athlete decided to go on the sly, saying that he did not believe her and wanted to personally look at the issued medical certificate. He appointed Kishla a meeting in the evening in a crowded place, which did not surprise her, because they always tried not to draw attention to themselves and do not get in front of anyone. A few days before the meeting, the boxer stopped by his old friend Luis Antonio Cadiz, who worked in a local machine shop and also had ties with the criminal world, selling illegal drugs. Felix briefly outlined the situation and asked him to help him get rid of his pregnant mistress. Luis had previously been in the field of vision of the police, and the prospect of being in prison scared him, but the athlete was persistent, assured that everything would go smoothly and the police will never come out on them. Besides, Felix promised him an impressive cash reward, and Luis agreed. With the support of an accomplice, Felix called Kishla and told her that he wanted to meet her on the evening of April 29th to confirm her pregnancy and decide what to do next. Immediately after talking to her lover, Kishla called her sister back and told her everything. She still had hope that Felix would accept her child and would not insist on an abortion. But Bereliz saw this situation as quite alarmed. She knew that the boyfriend had threatened her sister, and she was worried that he wouldn't do anything to her. Bereliz called her mother and shared her concerns, but even together they could not dissuade Kishla from that fateful meeting. At the appointed time, Rodriguez, taking a doctor's note, arrived at the meeting in her Kia Forte automobile. Verdejo drove there in his pickup truck, in the back of which Luis was hiding. Kishla immediately got into the athlete's car and showed him the results of the tests. He once again talked about terminating the pregnancy, but Kishla, crying, again responded with a refusal. Against this background, the couple began to quarrel violently, turning to shouting. Then Felix suddenly hit Kishla in the head with his fist, from which she immediately lost consciousness. Until Kishla regained consciousness, Felix took a syringe with a large dose of illegal substances hidden in the glove compartment of the car, which Luis had obtained at his request, and injected Kishla. Then, Together with his accomplice, they carried her to the back of the car, where there were already prepared pieces of wire and a concrete block. The men tied Rodriguez up, attached the load, and then covered her with a tarp, so that no one would accidentally see anything. Felix then returned to the pickup truck while his accomplice got behind the wheel of Kishla's vehicle. Together, they drove to the bridge over the San Jose Lagoon. It was virtually deserted at night, and the men, making sure no one could see them, threw Kishla, still alive, into the water. Afterward, however, they decided to fire a few test shots in pursuit, using the firearms they had brought with them so as not to leave the victim any chance. Having finished the massacre, each of the perpetrators went home. Kishla's co-workers were the first to worry when she didn't show up at the Veterinary Medicine and Aesthetics Center the next day. Kishla has always been very responsible and couldn't just not show up for work without notifying anyone. Since she didn't answer the phone, it was decided to contact her sister to find out what happened. After several unsuccessful attempts to contact her sister, she went to her house. No one answered the door, but Berylus had a spare key, so she got in without difficulty. However, she was met only by hungry animals who had not eaten anything for almost 24 hours. Now Berylus was already in a panic, because she realized that something terrible or irreparable had happened to Kishla. She immediately called her mother and told her everything, and then reported to the police about her suspicions and threats to her sister. She also called Felix, but he claimed that he had spent the previous evening and night at home with his family and had not gone to any meeting. The missing girl's mother took the first flight from Florida to San Juan. She thought that her lover might have taken her daughter to a private clinic and paid for her to have an abortion without her consent. Kayla didn't even want to think about the fact that Kishla was no longer alive. The first thing to do was to question the missing girl's neighbors and co-workers, but they didn't notice anything suspicious and couldn't provide the investigation with any useful information. In parallel, messages about the disappearance of Rodriguez were posted on popular social networks with requests to respond to those who know anything about her fate or current whereabouts. The case quickly received wide publicity, and when it became known that the missing girl was in a long-term relationship with a famous athlete and was expecting a child from him, reporters literally lined up to interview any of Rodriguez's family members. The relatives did not hold anything back and spoke out about their suspicions, among other things, blaming Felix for the incident. On April 30th, Kishla's car was found abandoned on the east side of the city, with her documents and personal belongings inside. No signs of struggle were found in the interior, giving a faint hope of finding its owner alive. On May 1st, a passerby strolling on the bridge over the lagoon saw a strange shape resembling a human body in the shallow water. He reported his discovery to the police, who soon recovered from the water the body of a young woman, presumably the same one the whole city had been looking for several days. Members of the Rodriguez family, who arrived to identify the body, hoped to the last that it was not Kishla, but their hopes were not realized. The body had been in the water for several days and changed a lot, but the girl was immediately identified by a remarkable tattoo on her arm. When news of the gruesome discovery hit the press, the residents of the city revolted and began to go out to spontaneous rallies, demanding punishment for those responsible. The same day, Verdejo was detained and taken to the police station for questioning, but the athlete categorically denied his involvement and claimed that on the night of Kishla's disappearance, he was at home with his family. As there was nothing to charge him, Felix was released on his own recognizance. One of the key witnesses was the athlete's legal wife, who at the first interrogation admitted that she was aware of his affair with Kishla, but that she had heard about her rival's pregnancy for the first time. On top of that, she did not confirm her husband's alibi, saying that he was not at home on the night of the murder. The first thing investigators did was check traffic surveillance footage on the way to the bridge from which Kishla was thrown. That's how they found Felix's pickup truck and the victim's car traveling behind each other, but the Kia Forte was clearly not driven by its owner. On the same day, the boxer's car was seized for examination, and in its body they found some hair of the deceased. Luis was the first to surrender to the police, promising to tell the whole truth in exchange for a reduced sentence. Felix was also taken into custody, but he refused to cooperate with the investigation, did not answer questions, and continued to deny his guilt, despite the presence of irrefutable evidence. A firearm was seized from Felix, which he used to shoot the victim from the bridge, and for which he had an official permit. Also, a cell phone check confirmed the fact that Felix, Luis, and Kishla were in the same location on that fateful night. Kishla's final farewell was on May 8th, and the funeral ceremony was all over the national news. It was a kind of action, calling for the perpetrators of the tragedy to be punished to the full extent of the law, as well as an action to draw public attention to the problem of gender violence. The coffin with Rodriguez's body was brought to the cemetery, not in a traditional hearse, but in a white carriage, over which white flower petals were thrown from the air. Many famous Puerto Rican natives, including show business stars, athletes, politicians, and public figures, have spoken out about the high-profile incident. Verdejo was charged with carjacking, kidnapping, premeditated murder, and the murder of an unborn child. All of these crimes together carried the death penalty, but the relatives of the deceased from the very beginning asked the court to elect a sentence of life imprisonment for the killer, so that he would suffer in captivity for the rest of his life. The hearing was repeatedly postponed due to the worldwide coronavirus pandemic, but in the spring of 2021, the trial was held in virtual mode. The court found that the crime was committed by a group of persons by prior conspiracy and with particular cruelty against a pregnant woman. It was possible to reconstruct the chain of events of that night and the details of the crime, mainly thanks to the testimony of Luis, who did not deny his guilt. He admitted that it was he who, at the request of a friend, got the drug for injection and also brought a wire and a concrete block to get rid of the body. But Felix continued to insist on his non-involvement in the case, although his words could not seriously affect the situation. By the way, the wife of the boxer, who acted in court as a witness, almost immediately after the arrest of her husband filed for divorce and tried to abstract from what was happening, focusing on the development of his business and raising a young daughter. According to some reports, not so long ago, Elisa Santiago remarried. Elisa herself admitted in an interview that she repeatedly received anonymous calls and messages with death threats, as well as death wishes to her and even Miranda. Many considered it was the spouse of the athlete as the organizer of the crime, but no evidence was found. In the summer of 2023, it became known that the jury, having familiarized itself with all the evidence and heard the testimony of all the witnesses, was finally ready to announce the final verdict. Felix Verdejo and his accomplice Luis Cadiz were found guilty on each of the charges against them, but despite this, the killers have not yet been sentenced. The next court hearing is scheduled for mid-November 2023. Most likely, both men involved in the deaths of Kishla Rodriguez and her unborn child will likely go to prison for life, with no right to ever leave prison. As the rain falls and the night deepens, thank you for being here with me at Radio Night Crime. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the need to stay aware, even in the stillness of the night. If you enjoyed tonight's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let the sound of the rain lull you to sleep, and until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night keep you company.